Welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman. I'm a Principal Microsoft Technical Trainer. I'm excited to be your guide for this Module 3, Implement Azure Container Apps. Part of the containerization module as part of the AZ-204 course. We're continuing a journey on how containers can be used as part of your app development lifecycle and where they fit from an Azure service perspective across a broad spectrum of container solutions that we provide. Container Apps is a relatively new service. It wasn't there at the original start of Azure, but it's been added to, and I expect new services to be added on a regular basis, similar to what Container Apps has done. What we're going to do is take a look at specifically where Container Apps falls into your solution and ways to configure and set these services up, as well as the orchestration that comes along with them. And so with that, I want to actually go off and do this compare and contrast to some of the other services that you have, where it fits in the model that you might want to work with. And also going to bring in some services that aren't part of the course, but you might want to consider possibly as part of your container journey. So starting with why I might even want to have individual management of containers, we've talked about, and you've probably seen this image in other recordings that I've done, that in modern applications, we deal with what are called microservices. And so as opposed to a monolithic application, which you could still deploy in containers, where you have a monolithic application where your entirety of your application gets deployed at once, the same application is represented in modern development using this microservice capability. In other recordings, we talked about using things like app service plans or IaaS or infrastructure as a service ways to deploy your application. So let's say, just for our demonstration, in a traditional application that maybe you ran on premises, maybe you've been building microservices on premises and you've moved this to the cloud. One of the modules we talked about to say, listen, I don't want to rewrite this. I've been using ASP.NET. We've been able to deploy on Windows servers. We know how to do that very well. The model that we would recommend is that you move to a thing called an app service plan, that you then could have an app service in, that you could then take your traditional application with no modification to the code and deploy it inside of an app service plan, hosting it on a platform as a service. So I'm going to sit there that, this left-hand side of the slide is going to be deployed using an app service plan. You know how to deploy operating systems, although you're not going to be deploying them. You know how the application works. So I'm good with that model. In a previous recording, we talked about a container instance or CI, where you could now deploy a new container. So let's say, for example, I'm now in a microservice model. I'm going to add a new feature to my product. And so we've talked about having a segmented network where you have your front end, you got your middle tier, and you got your back end that you're working with. I'm going to add a new front end feature. So I'm going to add a different color. I'm going to add an orange triangle. I have a whole new application that I'm going to be working with. That's great. So I'm going to have a new microservice, but I want to run it maybe in a container. Well, that's great. So you now could use maybe a CI, a container instance, to deploy that standalone container to deploy, and I'm going to start a container journey. And here's the reason why you might want to do that. Because if I had built it like a traditional application and added it part of my app service plan, well, I've still committed to an orchestration model that is based on my legacy technology and understanding. So we have to start this journey towards microservices and containers. So what I could now do, as I said, I could deploy this new container as a standalone container, but I'm not going to get any orchestration. That seems to be okay. But as we start to bring more and more new applications on, I'm now starting to take on more and more of that responsibility. And so now I've got a different front end piece that I'm going to be adding to my model. And I've got more containers now that I don't want to have to start to manage. So this is where a container instance might come along that now allows you to provide light orchestration across your multiple containers without having to go to a full AKS solution. So let's say at some point in time, we're at 80% of our applications deployed in the old model, and I'm at 20% now working with these new containers deploying my application to containers. I start to add new capabilities in the middle here. So I've got, a different green capability here. So I'm starting to build this out. Now I'm at 70-30. And over time, I'm going to have more applications built in the container model. And at some point in time then, when I want to make the change, I only have to take a small part of my legacy application and migrate it across into the container model. So this is part of a lifecycle management that a lot of people will look at from their application development to find a way to get lightly into containers, take on a bit more responsibility, but want some orchestration. That's where container applications come along. Container instances, it's all on you to build the orchestration, where a container app is going to provide a light orchestration. So we had container instances that you did this. You had containers as part of app services. So you could do the orchestration as part of app services, but it's now still a container. And so going back to that diagram I was just showing you, you could have a whole bunch of containers managed by app services. And eventually, as you want to take on Kubernetes administration, you could then just literally redeploy those containers under an AKS solution. And so this is what we talked about in another recording, container instances and containers as part of app service plans. And in this module, what we're going to be talking about is container apps. Which is the actual module, but this is where I'm also going to introduce AKS. Azure Kubernetes Services. So as a like-for-like comparison, this is going to be a fully orchestrated environment in which you can provide orchestration for your solutions, and one's going to come from the AKS solution, and one's going to come from the container app. So this is going to allow you to have multiple containers managed through a container app environment. So let's go into the portal and take a look at this. I'm going to create a container app, and very similar that we have with other Azure resources, I have to have my subscription. I have to have the resource group that I want to deploy this into. And then my container app name. I then have to pick which container image that I want to work with. So do I have one from a deployment source, or do I want to use source code or artifacts to deploy this? I'm just going to pick from a container image that we're going to have available to us. Typically, we have to deploy from a region. This is a regionally based resource. Remember, not all features are going to be available in all regions, but I can now deploy this to a region. And this is where I can take a look at my container app environment. This is going to be a grouping of resources that I can now pick based around a managed environment. So I'm going to click on the managed environment. We talked about zone redundancy in other recordings. We could either make the zone available to multiple data centers within the single region. Remember, not all zone redundancy is available in all regions currently. So if it is available in my region, which it is, I can now say I want some of these resources deployed in one data center in a region, and I can have other resources deployed to another, providing me zone redundancy and higher availability with inside of that region itself. We then take a look at our workload profiles. I'm just going to call this light apps. And we saw this before in all these different solutions, whether they be app service plans, whether they be container instances, you have to allocate a set of resources to the container environment in which you're going to be running it. In the case of a container instance, it's the resources for an individual pod. And here we saw that in the app service plans, you had to allocate to the app service plan, which gave it to all the apps in the app service plans. Now what we're going to be taking a look at is looking at underlying workload resources that are basically virtual machines. And if you remember that term nodes that we had for containers, containers run in nodes, which are all intents and purposes virtual machines. I can pick a virtual machine, whether it be dedicated resources, how much memory do I have, how much CPU. I'm going to pick this one. So I'm going to have 4 cores and 16 gigs of memory. I can provide some auto scaling. So I'm going to start off with 4. And so this is where that orchestration is coming from. I'm picking a node pool. So this is going to be a pool of nodes starting at 4 up to 45 that all have 4 cores and 16 gigs of memory. I could then deploy my containers to this workload. So what I'm building is sets of workload profiles that these become those pools of workloads that I want to add. So I could add more to this if I wanted to. So that's my workload profiles. You'll see this very similar to an AKS solution that I'm going to build, really not part of the course, but just to do that comparison. But this is basically what I'm doing without the full overhead of an AKS solution. I can allocate some networking to this. Does it have public network access? Is it private networking? What virtual network do I want to allocate this? But this is going to go off and create the container app environment. Now, while that's being built, so this is now where I'm going to deploy containers to this environment. So I've got my container demo. What image do I want to pull this from? So this is now going to the container build process. We've built the node infrastructure. So I can pull from an Azure Container Registry or from a Docker Hub or other location. Again, which subscription do I want to connect to? I've got my container information. I now go to my ingress. I should be able to create this container app environment that is going to provide the resource infrastructure and the orchestration of those resources. Now I'm going to go off while this is doing this. I'm going to come into an AKS solution and show you a similar creation, but this is going to be a full-blown Kubernetes cluster environment that we're going to go off and build. So very similar, but now I get the benefit of working with a full AKS solution. I have my subscription. What resource group do I want to build it to? I have my cluster presets. These are building those node values that we were just showing you a few minutes ago in the container app. And this is where I now start to pick which Kubernetes versions I want to work with. Am I going to provide some updates to the node infrastructure? Remember, this is now going to take over a higher level of administration of the underlying environment, what you don't have to do in the container apps. Here I can get into my node pools, very similar to what we were just working before. I can add a whole node pool, virtual machine scale sets. I call it heavy workload. What version of operating system do I want? I'm going to go to Windows Server 2022. And these become the underlying operating systems. What is the minimum number of nodes? What's the maximum number of nodes? So you're seeing that the AKS solution provides more control. So what this is doing is allowing me to now configure the nodes, the node pools that I'm going to now build and deploy. So we'll be doing this in the lab, but we've now come back. It's still deploying the apps environment. You've seen a whole bunch of resources coming along, and we'll show this in the actual lab itself. But what I've now done is I've shown you that build process of building the environment. Let's go back to the slides and take a look at the learning materials that matches this, and then we'll get into a lab that does all this activity for yourself. So through this series of recordings, we've seen that containers are a modern way to deploy applications. And that container then comes from a registry, and that was in a previous recording. We talked about setting up a container registry. You then took a look at ways to deploy those containers to run your applications. In a previous recording, we took a look at container instances, where you could deploy individual containers, but you provided the orchestration. We also did a compare and contrast in that recording, while it wasn't part of the actual learning material, to see how you could deploy individual containers without having to have you do the orchestration, but use a familiar environment that you might be familiar with using things like app service plans in that traditional application deployment. In this module, we're actually looking at container apps. It's a way to provide Kubernetes services without having to go into a full AKS solution, which was what we were just talking about. You saw some similarities. We're not just building a container instance with some resources allocated to it. We're building an entire server infrastructure. So how big is the server, and what are the pools like, that scaling capability to provide massive capacity requirements for your container environment. So depending on where you are, if you're just going to start off with one container, trying to get the heavy lift to learn about AKS and all the administration that you need is maybe a bit of an overkill. So I tried to detail a description that says, maybe you're on this journey that starts containers, start with a container instance. Maybe you want to then maybe move into multiple containers, getting some like orchestration using the app service plans. Then if you're going to go to a container app environment, you're going to get a heavier capability to manage the infrastructure without having to deploy an app service plan. And eventually, as you get used to that environment, you got more of your application running in containers. At that time, you want to then maybe move over to that AKS solution. So let's take a look at some of the container app services that we've just been showing to you in the portal. What you're going to get in a container app is the ability to run multiple containers in environments, which are basically the nodes and the node pools in which you're going to be able to deploy one or more containers into those environments. Now remember, the containers themselves are actually pods, which is where the resources are going to be allocated. And in that previous module where we recorded how to actually build these processes using your repo, taking your container image that you're having from your container registry, and through a build process, you then deploy the container to that environment that you're working with. And then the environmental variables and the values that come along with that as part of that YAML file that you would use to deploy those resources. This is just giving you some deeper insights into the authentication and authorization. We have a module that we're going to take a look at all of this process in general for all application development, but the authentication is the ability to identify who you are through some challenge response process, usually like a username and password that probably you're familiar with. And then the authorization, once you've been authenticated, how do I get authorized to see or do something? Your applications are going to need this because we've talked about containers by themselves are non-durable. They're volatile or stateless. So I need to find a way to get that information off into a durable storage. So you may need to connect to a file share, which is part of a storage account. A storage account, you need to have some credentials to be able to connect to it, whether it's through a SaaS token or some Microsoft Enter ID. So we're going to have a module that we take a look at authentication and authorization in more details. But we have that capability as built into the SDKs that are available for you to be able to provide an authentication and authorization component to your container apps. We've talked about managing the environment. That's what the container apps provide for you, is that light set of orchestration that comes along with this. Managing the revisions. So as you go through a version control change of your container environment, you can do container app updates that you're working with. I can pass environmental variables into them. What happens with the different levels of secret and secure information that you want to be able to pass off into it? Container apps provide all of the infrastructure for you to be able to manage that infrastructure. And we'll do some of that in the lab that we get into shortly. Dapper is an open source environment started originally by Microsoft, but we've made it available to the community to provide for a lot of the environmental and runtime application management around the container apps and all container environments you're dealing with. You're seeing some of the Dapper APIs. I mentioned the term sidecar applications that you might want to have. Maybe you want to deploy a monitoring app along with your application to see how the application is performing. So maybe you need to alert or log some information that's coming from that. So we've got a whole set of APIs that you can work with to be able to integrate with the actual containers in your deployment and your orchestration and management of that environment. So let's go off and do a lab where we're going to go into and build a container app. We'll use a bunch of command line tools to configure the environment and manage it and deploy applications to the containers themselves.
In this lab, I'll deploy a containerized application to Azure Container Apps using Azure CLI. Let's get into this. I need two namespaces to be registered for Azure Container Apps, and to ensure that they have been registered, I'm going to run these commands. An environment in Azure Container Apps creates a secure boundary around a group of container apps. I'm going to deploy that now. I sped this up for the purposes of the lab. So now that I've deployed the app environment, I want to finish deploying a container image to the environment. So it's been deployed. I'm going to take this URL and take a look at the container, but on my way there, I want to show you that the resources have been created in the resource group. Going to minimize this. I'll refresh this resource group. There are all the resources, and let me go to that web page. So that's the end of the lab. We've seen that we've been able to create a container environment, deploy a container to it, and a container app, and we've been able to access it. Let's go back to the recording.
Welcome back from the lab. Let's close out the module with our knowledge check. Question number 1, what is a revision in an Azure Container Apps? Go ahead and pause the recording. So an update or revision is an immutable change to the environment in which you're working with and creates a version specific, and you now have version control on that container apps environment. Question number 2, what is the purpose of the built-in authentication in Azure Container Apps? Go ahead and pause the recording. It is an out-of-the-box solution to provide for the federated authentication of a user account to provide security within your container solution. So this brings module number 3 to a close, where we've now taken a look at one of the solutions available in the spectrum of solutions to run containers inside of Azure. There are the 4 specifically that we've mentioned throughout these recordings of container instances and its counterpart that I always refer to as containers inside of app service plans in another recording. And this one's focused specifically on the container apps, which provides a light set of administration or orchestration along the containers, very much in line with its bigger brother version of an AKS solution. So this is a way to have that journey of, how much administration, how much control do you want to have over your containers, and what knowledge level do you have to be able to do that. This also brings the learning path to an end as well. We've covered 3 specific areas. We understood what a container is to begin with in the first recording of this series. It talked about a container repo, what a container is, and we saw that hierarchical structure of your code comes from a code repository. You've got a container image, either from a private or public container repository. You then have the ability to deploy that using a YAML build process, and that then goes to some kind of infrastructure to run it. That infrastructure is going to be based around a container existing in a pod. And so you can have multiple containers in that pod that share the resources. And we saw one way to deploy that was in a recording that we talked about container instances, where you provided the orchestration. We then also now close out in the third module a way to provide a higher level of orchestration, very similar to an AKS solution, where you get a broader set and administration and control in that orchestration over your container environment. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I look forward to you in another recording.